All right, so welcome back to The Young Idealist, my ongoing series on classical German philosophy and post-Kantian thought. And today I have a very special guest. I have Dr. Lewis Gordon, who is an American philosopher and Board of Trustees Distinguished Professor in Global Affairs and Department Head. Dr. Gordon's areas of specialization are Africana philosophy, existentialism, phenomenology, philosophy of science, social and political philosophy, philosophy of education, aesthetics, and philosophy in film, literature and music, philosophy of culture, race and racism, philosophy of medicine, psychiatry, psychoanalysis, and the global Southern thought. Currently, Dr. Gordon is the editor of the American Philosophical Association blog series called Black Issues in Philosophy with Jane Anna Gordon, and the book series Global Critical Caribbean Thought, also with Jane Anna Gordon, and the Journal of Philosophy and Global Affairs. Dr. Gordon is the author of Fear of Black Consciousness, published in 2022 from Farrar, Straus, and Giroux Press, as well as Freedom, Justice, and Decolonization, published in 2020 from Routledge, as well as What Fanon Said, A Philosophical Introduction to His Life and Thought, published in 2015 from Fordham University Press, as well as an Introduction to Africana Philosophy from Cambridge University Press in 2008, and one of my favorites, Fanon and the Crisis of European Man, an essay on philosophy and the human sciences published by Routledge in 1995. So thank you so much for being here, Dr. Gordon. It's wonderful to have you here.
Thank you for inviting me. And I'll just add two things. Since I was born in Jamaica, I always quip that I'm a Jamaican.
Okay.
And and the second thing is the blog series is co-edited with Tom Marr, spelled Meagher. He's one of my gifted former students. He now teaches at Sam Houston State in Texas. I just wanted to give him a shout out there. And again, thank you so much. And by the way, I'm glad you dig Fanon, the Crisis of European Man. It's its 30th anniversary. There's a special edition going to come out with commentaries from a global community of scholars. And I had the good fortune of discussing it this week in a doctoral seminar on global Southern phenomenology.
Well, again, thank you so much for that. And perhaps now we can jump into who was Frantz Fanon and what makes his thought remain important for us today.
Ah, yes, Frantz Fanon. It's funny. I had an interview yesterday with a French journalist talking about Fanon. There are many ways to talk about Fanon because his life was just so multidimensional. The banal thing is that he was born on the island of Martinique in 1925, so this is the 100th anniversary of his birth. Cool year for revolutionaries because El Malik al-Shabazz, known as Malcolm X, was also born in 1925, and also Patrice Lumumba, from the Congo, 1925. So what a year. Fanon was the baby though. Fanon was born in July. The others were in May and a little earlier. So he was born in the island of Martinique in 1925. Just to talk about his life would take up the whole time because his life was just so damn interesting. But so I'm just going to give the heavily redacted version, very short version. He was a very gifted child. He was from a family of 8 children, 4 boys, 4 girls. 2 of the girls died when they were young. His parents were rather unusual. His father worked for the customs at the docks, and his mother transformed their living room into a bodega, basically. So you could figure that out, right? Things come in to the docks, somehow they end up in a bodega. But anyway, this was because, of course, such a large family and a black family. There are some commentators trying to talk about him as petty bourgeois, et cetera. But no, I mean, when you're a family of 8 where brothers are piled up in a bedroom and sisters in one, that's not an affluent family. But the family believed absolutely in education. So his brothers and he managed to do very well. They went through the one lycée on the island available. This is the French secondary school system. And again, I'm jumping over a lot, but his last year of lycée, Fanon left the island of Martinique and joined the French resistance, and he fought in World War II. He was rather heroic, twice decorated. He was among those who were liberating communities well, communities, it's complicated there because they were desolated. So Jews, Roma, queers, all of these people who were being sentenced to death under the Nazi regime in World War II, he was among the soldiers liberating those concentration camps. He returned to Martinique, where he completed his lycée studies, lobbied for Aimé Césaire to become the mayor of the Fort-de-France, the big city, capital city of Martinique, under the communist ticket, left Martinique to study at first dentistry, and I always joke about that. Can you imagine a revolutionary dentist? But and there are revolutionary dentists, by the way. Firoz Manji is among them. But he shifted to psychiatry, so he left Paris and went to Lyon, where he got involved in varieties of activist movements, etc. Earned his degrees. He had 3 degrees: a degree in philosophy, a degree in sociology, and a medical degree in psychiatry, but not one area of psychiatry. You could tell this is a classic stereotype of a Caribbean man, right? He can't do one thing. He has to do 9 or 10, right? So he had training in forensic psychiatry, which made him a medical detective, and in clinical psychiatry, which made him a therapist. He briefly went back to Martinique, where, of all things, he was the medical examiner for the island. Big problem. Fanon hated to do autopsies. So you could imagine taking that job. And this is connected to what we're going to talk about, because the reason he hated to do autopsies is because he could not dissociate the person from the corpse. So for him, it really tapped into his profound humanism. I argue it's also connected into the fact that he also spoke Creole. Creolized languages, African Creolized languages, don't separate mind and matter, person and body. But anyway, he ended up getting into a kerfuffle on the island because he insisted on exhuming body of a woman from a suspicious case, determined she died from domestic violence. Nobody would do anything about it. He fought all the way through and then left the island. He realized he needed to be more powerful to intervene in such injustices. So he ended up in Saint-Alban, where to study to become what's called a chef de service. This is like the head medical person of a psychiatric facility. He was with a crazily talented, it's funny to use the word crazy after psychiatry, but crazily talented group of people. Among them was Francois Teskelis. And there's a whole conference I was involved with around Francois Teskelis. He's known for institutional therapy. He was a very gifted Catalan psychiatrist who was on the side of the Republican Army against the fascists in Spain. At the age of 22, he was in charge of the entire medical division. Anyway, he in Saint Alban organized a group of psychiatrists that began to develop a very different approach to the study of psychiatry. And this was compatible with Fanon's, which we'll get to talk about. The relationship of Fanon to Teskelis was more like comrade. Even though Teskelis was the one to certify him to be a head of a hospital, independently they had a lot of the same ideas. And this is an institutional therapy is basically the view that not all mental illness is a function of neurological illness, that ultimately illness is a dysfunctionality of relationships. So ultimately, institutional therapy says if you find a lot of sick people, it's highly likely because there's sick institutions, a sick society, etc. You see? So Teskelis and his comrades, among them included a very famous psychiatrist by the name of Orly, were examining what it is for hospitals to be sick. In other words, you send people to a sanitarium for mental illness, but what if sanitariums are producing mental illness? And so Fanon, after achieving his chef de service, briefly taught in Normandy and then went to Algeria. He always wanted to go to the African continent. He was there before during World War II. He wanted to go to Senegal, but Senghor didn't answer him, and I have a lot of hypotheses around that. But he ended up in Algeria. He at Blida Hospital, which is now Frantz Fanon Hospital. He took that approach uh, uh, to his management style. When he arrived, there were people in straitjackets, chains, treated terribly, etc. Although a majority Muslim country, all the images around them were of Catholic saints and all of this kind of stuff. In other words, what could be called depersonalization, okay, and also dehumanization. So Fanon insisted that all that Christian iconography be taken off, a lot of the transformations of the place to set up practices that would affirm the dignity of the patients. He had great results. However, as we know, the Algerian War broke out. It was horrific. Uh, Today, I mean, the French were really, really awful. But the truth of the matter is, and this is something you learn from Fanon, it's not so easy to say good guys and bad guys. There are a lot of things from Liberation Nationale, the National Liberation Front, was doing that was absolutely abominable. So in this horrific situation, Fanon said, however, there is a difference between what the FLN was fighting for versus the French. There's a difference between fighting to maintain colonialism versus fighting at least avowedly against it. The reason I say avowedly, because yeah, what was an Algerian? An Algerian was a multi-ethnic society of Berbers, Arabs, Jews, Christians, different groups, and all kinds of things. But some people were not fighting for that diversity. And a lot of the FLN was actually fighting for Arab nationalism. So even though it was a liberation struggle, it also had a consequence of alienating a lot of, well, their people who had to leave. But anyway, Fanon, the young, he's a young man, about 29 years old, but he's going into 30, 31. He joins the FLN and becomes a kind of Robin Hood type figure, outlaw intellectual. In fact, the Main Rouge, the Red Hand, the conservative group in France, had him on the hit list. There were many assassination attempts. Fanon did all kinds of things. He even did why I say Robin Hood, the famous Robin Hood story where Robin Hood couldn't resist showing up to the archery contest, so he disguised himself. Well, Fanon, despite being a wanted man, couldn't resist going to Paris for the Black Writers Conference. So he showed up disguised. He wrote down his name as Amy Césaire. You'll see in a recount of this by James Baldwin. James Baldwin said, wow, there were two Amy Césaires at the conference. The young one was really fiery, and the young one was Frantz Fanon. Anyway, he eventually he migrated to Tunisia, where he continued to do his work with the FLN. He opened a day clinic in Tunis, which, by the way, influenced Foucault, although Foucault doesn't at all acknowledge Fanon in his writings. But Foucault, a lot of those ideas about madness and civilization in the clinic could be found in his studies in Tunisia, and there was the Fanon Day Clinic. Fanon then became an ambassador for the FLN because the FLN had a problem. Uh, People talk about colonialism these days, but look, the caliphates did colonize a lot of North Africa, did not see themselves as Black Africans. And so, as Black African countries were becoming independent and Northern Arab dominated countries wanted allies, a lot of the Black countries are saying, look, we're not sure you're on our side. So it was very good to have a Black ambassador to Ghana, to Nigeria, to a lot of those places. And Fanon was very successful in gaining support, particularly across the Sahara. However, he developed leukemia, and in the last years of his life, in his ambassadorial capacity, his dream was to create a United States of Africa, and I could explain why. later. But anyway, he sought medical treatment in the Soviet Union. They said the best place was Bethesda, Maryland. The CDC, which Trump and them are trying to destroy right now. I mean, that's the best medical facility in the world. And so he said, why do I have to go to a nation of lynchers? Because he's a black man. And although his wife was Roma and Corsican in the United States, she would be a white woman. The situation was too far gone. And on December 6, 1961, a little after 5 p.m. Eastern Time, he passed away from pneumonia as a consequence of his leukemia. So that gives you a little summary. There's a lot of juicy other details, but for the audience, that could give a taste of what his life was about. And there every moment has great stories. I mean, crazy great stories. One of them I have to just say briefly because I know we have to go on, but one crazy great story is that period before he went to medical school when he returned to the island after fighting in the war. He organized a soccer team. They call it football in the islands, right? All of the soccer clubs had colonial type names like the Settlers Club, the Golden, this, all of these names. Fanon organized a soccer team with his brothers called Assault. And Assault really assaulted the other teams. They whooped them really, really terribly. But the last thing, and then we could move on, is I got to say about Fanon is that there are many kinds of Fanon that we could talk about. But today, we already know he's canonical. If you don't read Fanon going through certain areas of thought, you would appear illiterate. That's the sign of a canonical thinker. But the second thing about him, he's not just a canonical thinker, but and this is what I said to the French reporter yesterday. But he is a superstar in the iconic sense. Fanon, because there are movies being made about Fanon, there are comic books, there are all Fanon is this glorious, extraordinary, and very sexy. Because if you see pictures of him, there are people who at times catch a breath at how charismatic and beautiful that man was. So we're talking about a very rare force that came on the planet Earth in 1925 and died at the age of 36 in 1961.
Well, thank you so much for that really rich biography. You really gave the viewers and myself such a warm and also in-depth um, description, and also just such a wonderful kind of dynamic understanding of Fanon's life. Right now, in a time, especially in the States, where you see critical race theory and being under attack, and you see many things going on. Um, I see Fanon's thought, and as a thinker, as you said, in this canonical kind of sense, being so important. So just to bring us back here for a second, what do you think? Why do you think Fanon's thought is so important right now? How can we reinterpret Fanon's project now, currently?
Okay. Well, I think we need to look at Fanon in a multidimensional way. Okay. Now, right now, we are living uh, frighteningly under the resurgence of forms of authoritarianism that are clearly not only fascist, but also reassertions of specifically Nazi and white supremacist versions. Now, in a way, that's redundant because the Nazis were actually inspired by the United States. A lot of people don't realize that, but from its eugenics movements, from its manifest destiny movement. So it's no accident that we're seeing this, and not just in the United States, of course, because at the time, as we know, when we're looking at the 1930s into the end of World War II, this was being inspired across the Middle East. It was affecting parts of South Asia, and it had an impact on East Asia. So we're seeing, you know, old chickens coming home to roost. It's a recurrence. However, a big mistake would be to say that it's the same. The reason, and I'll explain why later, why that would be a mistake. Okay, I see it as a continuation than a same, because when something continues, it can transform, but it's committed to something that is retrograde. Now, at the heart of this, why Fanon is relevant today is connected to his multidimensionality. Fanon did argue against colonialism. He argued against racism. He argued against sexism. He argued against homophobia. A lot of people don't realize this because there are people who attack Fanon as homophobic. Fanon argued against anti-Semitism. The list is very long. But he didn't argue against them in a haphazard way. For Fanon, all of them had something in common, and that is dehumanization. If we look at what's happening right now, what we're seeing is a profoundly dangerous situation of psychopaths and sociopaths inheriting the power of capital. In other words, and the thing, why I say, and I'm not being metaphorical, I'm talking about actual psychopaths and sociopaths. There's a difference. And I'm bringing this up because Fanon was a psychiatrist. Psychopaths are born. There are people who don't have empathy. There are people who see the rest of the world instrumentally. For a psychopath, there's no difference between manipulating you and moving a chair. Okay? Uh, they all have narcissistic disorder because if you're the only one with agency, then you're superior to everybody else. So for Fanon, supremacist thinking is pathological. Okay? But supremacist thinking, although it's pathological, it's not necessarily psychopathological. It could also be sociopathological. Sociopaths are not born sociopaths. They are produced by an environment without empathy, without care, and that normalizes, and in fact, even punishes them for showing any sign of compassion. So sociopaths then tend to reproduce psychopathy. So they attempt to organize the world in such a way to make it a liability for their fellow human being to show compassion, care, or empathy. Now, if you think back to what I said earlier about institutional therapy, then it's pretty clear that the psychopath and the sociopath try to erase the humanity in human institutions. And we're seeing that in the United States. That's what's happening. It's an effort to cultivate a sociopathological society. Although Fanon used words like oppression, domination, and so forth, he didn't just use them, he interrogated them. So all forms of oppression are forms of dehumanization because Fanon understood the human being as a living expression of agency and freedom. So this requires power. Now, I have to define power if I'm going to say this. Power is the ability to make things happen with access to the conditions of doing so. Now, every human being has abilities, but if you don't have access to the conditions, those abilities are not realized. You need food, shelter, clothing, education. You know, the list is long. If you're a good artist, you're going to need to have some context to express it. If you want to be a medical, you know, it doesn't matter. It's pointless to say what your abilities are if you don't have access to conditions. Now, a condition that human beings have created that has given us extraordinary power is the social world. The very fact that a social world exists with language, meaning, technologies, etc., is one of the reasons you could be where you are and I could be where I am, and we can communicate. So it enables us to have an impact beyond ourselves. And of course, when you and I have finished speaking, others could view this conversation, and that is power. It transcends us. And if for whatever reason this survives our death, there are people who could revisit it. And if we have something that they can learn from in our conversation, that is power too. So that's power in the good sense. Human beings need that. However, some people, if you go back to psychopathy and sociopathy, want to block other people's access to the conditions of power, conditions to the social world. So all of this dismantling going on in the US right now is to disempower people, is to get rid of the conditions, enable people to live healthy lives, education, clean water. The list is long. Okay? So that's how Fanon regarded oppression. Oppression is to block the conditions that people need to live livable lives. Within that framework, then, you could see obviously the fact that I'm able to give examples today why he's relevant today. So for him, racism is a form of dehumanization. Now, one other thing I should say, just because I'm bringing up Fanon now, before I get to the next part, because many aspects of why we should read him today, but I'm going to bring up Ponoamas Blanc, Black Skin, White Mask, his first published book. I'm bringing it up because a lot of people misunderstand what he's arguing in that book. They think the book is about Black people wearing white masks, but that's not what the book is about, all right? The book is about the lies that colonialism produce. And among the lies is the lie of racism. Not that there isn't racism, but what gives credence to racism. Racism, I've already pointed one lie, is the lie that there is such a thing as an intrinsically superior human being. The correlate of that lie is the notion that there's an intrinsically inferior human being. Those are two lies. Black skin is the lie of an intrinsically inferior human being. In other words, to seal black or brown, whatever category of color, but usually black, into our skin as incapable of transcending our skin. Now, the way I just described the social world, the ability to have an impact on reality, on the world, it means every human being should be able to reach beyond our body. But what anti-Black racism does is to try to force Black people to have no impact on the world beyond our bodies. You're sealed into your skin, you see? But there's another lie, and that's the lie of superiority. That's the lie told to white people. You see, there's no really intrinsically black or white or brown anybody. But once you construct people as white, the lie of whiteness is the mask that white people have to wear of superiority. And that lie, he says it, is a narcissistic disorder. Because you notice how it maps onto psychopathy and sociopathy. I am superior to others. I have the right to everything. I control everything. The world is only good if I'm running it. All of that kind of stuff. Well, the truth, what Fanon basically says, and he says it in Ponoamas Blanc, Black Skin, White Mask, is if you're going to push some human beings below human and push another group above human, at the heart of that is misanthropy, is the anti-human. So, and he had a poetic way of putting it. He said, it's the attempted murder of man. In other words, wherever oppression exists, humanity is endangered. Why he's relevant today is because all of these things we're seeing happening in Hungary, in India, at efforts moving in Germany, what's happening all across the Middle East, because there is no humanistic country in the Middle East right now. Every single one is dedicated to erasing human agency. We see it happening in the United States. We see they're not out of the woods yet in Brazil. You know, there's an effort, right? There are other places as well. At the heart of all of these, then, is it's not just that they're racist or sexist and so forth. It's that at the core of what they're up to is an attack on humanity. It's misanthropy. And if you think about this, Fanon is tapping into, on a philosophical level, the core ideals of what we historically called the left. Not the left as a political party, but historical leftism was humanistic, egalitarian, it was about equity, it was about freedom, right? And freedom understood as belonging, a condition of possibility like a home. It was about potential, that human beings should be able to flourish. These are all historic left ideals. What are historic right-wing ideals? To get you out of crisis, you must eliminate the conditions of having to make decision. That's why historical right-wingism and conservatism go for law, order, tradition, attack on difference, the elimination, you see where this is going, and a valorization in psychoanalytical terms of the father, because the father functions as the all-powerful God in relation to whom you're not to make decisions. But ultimately, this leads to a form of homogeneity in which you cannot tolerate any difference, which is fascism, where you'd have to eliminate also the humanity that remains in yourself. So, and here's the insight that Fanon had. It's not necessarily the case that left-wing, avowed left-wing groups are immune to this, because there's a form of leftism that says the goal of leftism is to create a kind of permanence in which nobody has to make a decision anymore. But that is fascism. So Fanon identified, and this is in his later text, Le Damné de la Terre, the damned of the earth, known as the wretched of the earth, where he goes to town. He is critical of post-colonial bourgeoisies because he's accusing them, and not even accusing, he's analyzing their tendency simply to replace colonialism with a new kind of colonization premised upon having people stratified, beholden, subjected, or subjugated to the revolution. He argues that freedom is about setting the conditions for other generations to live lives that fit them. In other words, the people who may be good for knocking out the colonizer may be the greatest enemy to the future of liberation and freedom of their people. And that's why Fanon concluded Le Damné de la Terre with the importance of building new concepts and setting afoot a new humanity. What he means by that is that we need to take seriously that if we're going to fight dehumanization, we need to embrace a form of love for our humanity, not posthumanism, all of this stuff. So that's one thing. And now, very quickly, because we can come, it connects beautifully to what this program's title is, Young Idealists. All right. Uh, there is, uh, outside of the political part I just said, Fanon, even if even if these problems weren't here, let's say there wasn't a resurgence of fascism and everything's going great, and we're post nation states. Fanon, by the way, was against nation states. That's another discussion. But we're in a global, free world. Fanon would still be relevant. And the reason why is he'll be relevant for the reason Simone de Beauvoir would be relevant, Jean-Paul Sartre would be relevant, for the reasons Camus, Merleau-Ponty, or even if we go back, even if we go back to Nietzsche or Kierkegaard. The reason, and others in India, Aurobindo, many others. And the reason is this: is the existential dimension of his thought. Because you see, the existential dimension of his thought is what's linked to the humanism I just described. Fanon's response to Euro-modern colonialism is one, it attacks humanity, which means you should meditate on what it means to be a human being. Two, it attacks freedom. And all existentialists see a symbiosis of humanity and freedom. Three, and this one we're seeing all over the place, it attacks conditions of justification by undermining our capacity to reason communicatively with one another. To make it plain, the very fact that philosophy, literature, the sciences were rallied for the forces of dehumanization put the sciences in crisis. but you don't respond to it by being unreasonable. What you need to do is to have a richer conception of reason against a distorted rationality. That's all the existentialists argue this. Fanon too. Next, all of the existentialists, every existentialist is ultimately a dialectician, but not in the narrow sense of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, because that's an a priori conclusion. What they're dialecticians because they argue that human beings are not contraries. We're not all like a god or absolute nothing, which would collapse into a thing. The moment we interact, we discover our limitation, but also our transcendence. So, in other words, pointing out contradictions opens up possibilities. You see it all the way back from Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, all the way through. Fanon was similar. His ultimate argument was that colonialism produces apartheid. Humanity needs dialectical interaction. In order to have oppression, you have to keep people apart, but to have humanity, you have to get people together. The other one is all existentialists defend dignity. And there are others, but these are in Fanon. So if these values matter to you, humanity, freedom, reasonability, justifications, dignity, stuff like that, questions of ethical responsibility, Fanon's relevance continues.
Well, I can just only say this, that your students are very lucky to have a professor, a teacher, a speaker like yourself, because I was just completely enthralled in your answer that I think was really, really, really profound.
Thank
And
you.
also really, really great. You're hitting all these wonderful points and bringing everything to the present. You brought up so many things, psychiatry, sociopaths. You brought up existentialism, which leads me to my next question. If you could bring all of this together and you could talk about perhaps Fanon's influences, who are his maybe psychiatric influences, his psychological influences, philosophical, existentialist influences? Who are these influences that help um, bring into this his own kind of unique system?
Here's a beautiful thing. First thing, you notice the way I ended with the point about dialectical, right? Position. There's some people who think today in such a crass reductionistic way that it would turn Fanon's stomach. Fanon wants to learn from humanity. He doesn't take the position that one group of people have the answers to everything. So I'll give you an example. When his brother Joby visited him one time in Algeria, his brother was going through some studies for an additional degree. Fanon walked over to his library. He read a lot. And he took out a book. And he said, "You see this little book?" And it was Descartes' Discourse, you're right? On method. He said, "More has been written about this little book in the French language than so many of the other books." His point was, of course, that that's a book that was addressing that third element of what I was talking about, the problem of justification. And it's not just Descartes, but he brought this up because there are a lot of things with Descartes that Fanon's critical of, mind-body distinction and so forth. But his point is he can appreciate learning from somebody with whom he had an intellectual disagreement. Okay? So for Fanon's influences, well, if we got Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, it's obviously there. The theory of national consciousness in Le Dernier de la Terre. That's Fanon's transformation of Rousseau's notion of the general will. Okay? The will in general, which is just the collection of interests. Fanon gave a critique of nationalism. Will in general could be nationalistic, but the general will thinks about the interest of the nation, the people, or the globe. So that's broader. And of course, Rousseau's dialectic thinking, particularly in the discourse on the arts and sciences. Definitely, Fanon was not a Kantian, but Fanon appreciated Hegel. But he read Hegel in a very different way. For Fanon, it wasn't, he didn't see himself as applied Hegel, because, for instance, he points out that there are elements that he's critical of the kind of Hegelianisms that lead to closure. This is really crucial because Fanon read, for instance, Black thinkers in the Caribbean. He was aware of the Haitian Revolution, people like Antonin Firmin. There were people, there were poets. He would read, and the ideas from Césaire were very important. He loved Nietzsche. Now, may seem shocking to people because today people talk about Nietzsche as a conservative. Nietzsche had a way of being very cruel in his language, but I think there was something deeper at work. The Nietzsche that Fanon appreciated is the dialectician Nietzsche. This is the early Nietzsche. This is the Nietzsche of the birth of tragedy from the spirit of music. And why I say this is because what Nietzsche identified is exactly what I talked about when I talked about right-wing leftism. Nietzsche, in that book, started off with a healthy society as Aeschylean. That's the poet Aeschylus, where everybody can contribute. So in the Aeschylean moment, the chorus, the family, you see what I'm saying? Everybody, the drummers, the dancers, everybody can contribute. But then you have the Sophoclean moment, which is the revolt of patriarchy. This is when it's all masculinism. And interestingly enough, this is the period of philosophy. So this is where Nietzsche disagrees with Hegel, right? Hegel loves the Sophoclean moment. Nietzsche says, no, the Sophoclean moment is decadence. And the reason is because it now constructs a contrary. It's the man versus the rest. Then there's the Euripidean moment. And a lot of people say that's the liberatory moment. Because as you know, Euripidean moment was the tragedian of the woman. And Nietzsche, and this is why people call Nietzsche misogynist and conservative, because Nietzsche said, no, that is not liberation. That's just flipping over one contrary with another, which is the same argument Fanon makes. Decolonization, when he says it's just the replacement of one group with another, that's not revolutionary. What is needed, Nietzsche was arguing, is to be connected to the life spirit of dialectical practice when the full creativity of society can come to play. Fanon argues the same thing. You see, that argument I think is also in Fanon's anti-nation statism. It's in mine. I take the same position too. I think nation states ultimately conservative. It's to resolve everything and reduce everything to the nation. And it puts power. The problem if you put power and nation together, you have people who are outside of the state because of not being in the nation. And you're going to have racism, colonialism, all of it. And we're seeing it right now. Right? I think humanity needs to outgrow nation states. Nietzsche's argument would work for that. Fanon's argument is very similar. Okay. Another person, obviously, that we could see Fanon through would be Husserl, would be Karl Jaspers. Karl Jaspers, absolutely, would be Freud. He has disagreements with Lacan, but he appreciates Lacan, the psychoanalyst Lacan. He loved Anna Freud. Simone de Beauvoir. There's some Fanonian arguments that are Beauvoirian arguments. And he knew her. Her ideas clearly had an influence on him, especially the way she articulates freedom. Sartre. It was not only an intellectual affinity, and again, Fanon can respect someone while criticizing them. He offers a critique of Sartre in Point Noir Mas Blanc that he basically accused Sartre, and Sartre agreed with him, of naive Hegelianism. Naive Hegelianism has an a priori synthesis before going through the dialectical process. To put it for the viewers, if they want to know what I mean, if you think the world is your room and somebody opens the door and says, what are you doing in here? You're going to discover the world is not your room But what you don't know is if you go out that door, whether you'd fall down, rise up, or go forward. You don't know. You have to step out the room to know it. And then when you step out that room and realize you didn't fall down, go up, or whatever, you now have an interesting meta dialectical question, which is dialectical. Is this outside just another room? And maybe the next door I open, I will fall. You see how the process goes. So this is what enabled Fanon to be able to respond to orthodox Marxism that said that you can't have Black revolutions or South Asian revolutions or, and revolutions outside of the Euromodern context without following its stages from bourgeoisie to proletariat. You see what I'm saying? All of those. Why? Why can't you have a revolution that goes from enslavement to something different because you're informed by different cultural practices that were brought from Africa or from South Asia? So Merleau-Ponty was also of great influence for two reasons, both intellectually, but he was Fanon's teacher. That's who taught Fanon philosophy. I mean, he studied philosophy in the Lycée, but at the university, Merleau-Ponty was his professor at Lyon. But Jung, he refers to Jung as the cosmic Jung. I mean, Jung, the cosmic Jung. But if you think about Jung's notion of the mask and shadow, that insecure people try to wear a mask to hide their real self, which is their shadow that they're afraid of. That is the white mask that Fanon talked about. And he brings up Jung in the text. But he had a profound respect for Karl Jaspers. And for good reason. Karl Jaspers stood up to Nazis in World War II. Karl Jaspers had a radical open conception of freedom. He never thought reductionistically. When Jaspers talked about truth, it wasn't one truth. He talked about four kinds of truth: pragmatic, spirit, scientific, transcendent truth. When we're dealing with what he called ciphers, the is not only knowing you can reach for the stars, but a fundamental part of being a human being is knowing you're not God. You're not God. And this is where Fanon parts company with Sartre, because Sartre, as we know in on Being and Nothingness, L'être rien, argued that the human beings a desire to be God. The answer is no. Most human beings don't desire to be God. The psychopath wants to be God, the sociopath, the narcissist. Spiritual, religious, and political stories remind us we're not God, but not being God doesn't mean we lack agency. Not being God doesn't mean we don't have power, and not being God doesn't mean we're not responsible. Political responsibility is crucial. There are many more I could bring up in terms of Fanon, because he was also, of course, in a live exchange with other revolutionaries of his generation. People like Ali Shariati, who was just, from Iran, people like Kwame Nkrumah. The list is very long. But the main thing is that he understood what I call, uh, uh, well, let me formulate it this way. There's an error people make that I call theodicy of the text. And that is when you read a text as if it were written by God. If you read a text as if it's written by God, then you ignore its contradictions because it must be perfect. But if you read texts as written by human beings, and you can love human beings with their imperfections, then you can learn from the text as a dialogue with thought. That is how he approached great intellectuals of the past and his contemporaries, that they were fellow people with whom to learn, and in cases from whom to learn, but never to fetishize.
An absolutely fantastic answer, and also very rich as well too. So you did give us a lot, and you gave us a lot of influences, and also not just direct influences, but also interlocutors, which I really, really enjoyed, and I think the viewers will also enjoy. How do you how do you distinguish or maybe differentiate between Fanon's philosophical ideas, political ideas, and perhaps psychoanalytic ideas? We've we've talked about this idea of the humanism, and his approach is to, kind of search why there's this dehumanization process going on in certain areas. So how do you differentiate between his philosophical ideas, his psychoanalytic ideas, and maybe his political ideas? Or do you see them as this kind of a collective synthesis? We've been talking about dialectic here. How do you read Fanon, if I can put it in that sense?
I I see him as a relational thinker, and in that regard, they were not separate. Okay. For Fanon, the which is one of the reasons I made him so intense and so passionate, because for him, um, a good example is let's start with a psychiatrist. As a, Fanon, the psychiatrist, took the position that not all mental illnesses were neurological. Okay. But then when he looked at mental illnesses, he noticed that uh, there's an underlying theme of mental illness was an effort to escape our freedom. We can escape our freedom narcissistically, but right, which is again turning away from reality. You know what I mean? We could do it, but we could also um, do escape our freedom through recoiling from the truth of dehumanization. So Fanon was at the heart of how we practice psychiatry, already committed to the question of dehumanization, depersonalization, a lot of the negations of what makes us outward. And he says it in his writings. So uh, uh, ultimately, this leads now to the philosophical question of turning away from reality. For Fanon's a problem. For Fanon, the task is for us to develop a healthy relationship with reality, which for Fanon meant with our fellow human beings and our broader environment. This question, it hits the heart of how you connected philosophical, political, and psychiatric and psychoanalytical issues, because as a therapist, the job he saw as a therapist is to make the human being at home with her, his, or their environment. But what if the environment is a racist, sexist, homophobic, misanthropic one? The only way to make that human being at home with that environment is to turn that human being into a sociopath. In other words, your society is racist, be a racist. Your society is sexist, be a man, be sexist. And for a woman, be a man, be sexist. You see, it goes either way. If it's class oriented, be, deal with class warfare. Just take the side that dominates. You see where I'm going with this. So what Fanon, why they're connected is what Fanon realized, and this is part of his creativity, is that meta-psychiatry, in other words, the theory of psychiatry, and the same thing for psychoanalysis, meta-psychoanalysis, the theory of psychoanalysis, which I argue is actually psychoanalytical and phenomenological, all of those is to take the disguise off of what impedes our relationship with reality. But the moment you do that, because you relate, you're now in a dialectical involvement. So they're all connected. And what he ends up arguing is that if you think about, for instance, what I said earlier about the social world and sociality, it means that at the heart of every truth has to be its communicability, which means there's always the question of the other. And in fact, he puts it in a very interesting way. And by the way, Husserl did this too. Merleau-Ponty did. But Fanon, I think, put it in a very interesting way that's a little, direct to the point. He says, okay, if you have a self-other relationship, that's an ethical relationship. But what racism and all forms of dehumanization attempt to do is to say they're only the self, the other, and the non-selves and the non-others. Now, if you're not an other and you're not a self, it gives license for anything to be done to you. And if you think about it, in all the examples of carnage, genocide happening today, that's exactly what happens. What's happening to Palestinians, as an example, is the construction of Palestinian people as non-people, non-selves, non-others. If you look at the logic of the language being done against the Ukrainian people, the language is non-selves, non-others. One of the things that was done against Jews in World War II, non-selves, non-others, but a lot of people right now are missing that even in the question of Israel, they're lumping all of Israel into a conception of Zionism that makes all Israeli people non-selves, non-others. Within, there's a conflict, a dialectical conflict of people fighting against Likud and the other parties there. Similarly, in the Arab world, there are a lot of people in struggles trying to say they're selves and others, but there are regimes that are structured in ways that are non-selves, non-others. And we're seeing, if we go and interrogate this in South America and other places, things, right, about and the indigenous peoples, if you look at, so in other words, there's no short list. If you look at what's going on in the Sudan, if you can go through many, Mauritania, you can go through all of these. So what Fanon pointed out then is the kind of a lie, if you go back to that point, it's about Nietzsche, about contraries, et cetera. These are all themes that fit the title of this program, of course, because a lot of people, when you say idealist, a lot don't realize the kind of idealism is connected to transcendental forms of argumentation, which look at conditions of possibility. If you eliminate the other, you have no longer a condition of possibility for evidence, truth, social world relations. And some people say, yeah, but I could be by myself and imagine another. No, you don't. Because that other is just an analogical projection of yourself. What Husserl said, what Merleau-Ponty said, and what Fanon said is that the other is a real other. It's not you, it's another human being. You are an other to another human being who's a self. And people who are afraid of being an other are afraid of ethics. And people who erase others are avoiding ethics. So that element is a crucial insight, and you could see how it all connects. Now, he wasn't trying to be systematic because, of course, his critique of Sartre is, hey, Jean-Paul, you're an existentialist. Why are you putting a system before a thought? Remember, existence precedes essence. Don't make dialectics a synthesis that precedes existence. So, but the existential part is what says there got to be real others. You see, the communicative part. And this connects to African philosophy too, because I brought up the creolization of his thought. He spoke Creole, and in a lot of African languages, and a lot of Asian languages too. And it was historically so in Europe, but it's a long story. Euromodern capitalism put the psychopathy there, the psychopathology, and say, that's not human nature. Human nature is to be selfish, greedy, blah, 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 F the rest of the world. That's not true. If that were true, humanity would have died out. First of all, Homo sapiens wouldn't have popped up. And the reason we wouldn't have popped up is because Homo erectus would have died out. Because if they were that way, and Homo erectus would have died out, Australopithecus the preceding hominins would have died out because they were just too selfish to take care of one another. So, so we know if anybody takes 1 second to think about how much investment it takes for a human being from birth to sexual maturity, that's a lot of investment. We are social animals, but it doesn't mean that pathologies don't pop up. And what's the irony of our condition is these psychopaths who are trying to destroy humanity are able to be in this position because humanity cared for them. Isn't that a weird irony? But within that framework, what unfolds is an understanding that this question of real others, the evidentiality and the communicability, those are the transcendental conditions. And so Fanon, interestingly enough, is not just that he's a famous and canonical thinker, but he's a thinker whose legacy is connected to very much what the title of this program is about.
Well, I've actually never had anyone tie in uh, the ideas and the thought that and the thinker that we're discussing to the idea of the of my program. So that's amazing. Thank you so much for doing that. How can we bring Fanon in this relation between Africana philosophy and as well as the ideas behind decolonizing or the decolonization project?
Okay. You know, earlier when I said that Fanon was a relational thinker, so the first thing we should bear in mind is that Africana philosophy is philosophy. It it's just that we always enter philosophy from a certain orientation. Okay, this is a basic phenomenological insight. You got to have a body, you got to have a somewhere. And sometimes a somewhere may bring resources that you didn't think about from somewhere else. And sometimes you say, oh, wait a minute, it is here too. I just didn't realize it. So, for instance, when I wrote the Introduction to Africana Philosophy, the first thing I said is uh, Africana philosophy emerged under the conditions of Euro-modern colonialism. And that means that there's a tendency to racialize the thought in such a way that impedes its status as thought. To put it in mundane terms, there tends to be a more of an interest in who are Africana philosophers than what Africana philosophers thought. I see that as a great disservice. So, for instance, when I wrote Fanon, the Crisis of European Man, I said I was engaging Fanon's thought, and if it's useful for what were my projects. It was much later on, after developing a lot of my thought, that I decided to do some scholarship specifically on Fanon's life and thought, which is what Fanon said, that later book. Now, why I mention this is then most people at the time when I wrote an introduction to Africana philosophy would have thought Africana philosophy would be to put together a set of Black thinkers and then just call it Africana philosophy. But that's not an intellectual project. In that book, the manuscript was 550 pages. The published form is different, but uh, I decided that Africana philosophy had to be a set of philosophical questions. And whoever engages those questions is an Africana philosopher and more, because nobody's only one kind of philosopher. You know, I mean, one could be, you could talk about French thought and French philosophers, but some are post-structuralists, some are postmodernists, some are, you know, more analytical, whatever. So it struck me that there are a set of questions that if you're dealing with them together, you are highly likely an Africana philosopher. Okay. And what I said in the book was you have to ask the question, uh, given what has emerged in the Euro-modern world, what does it mean to be a human? The philosophical anthropological question. In other approaches to philosophy, philosophical anthropology is like, it's not important, you know, or lower. If you think about even Heidegger's attack on Sartre, you know, he said it's humanism, you know. this idea that you're to erase the human to have real thought. Uh, that that's not only problematic in Africana philosophy, but if you look at if you look at a lot of African philosophies, that is an abomination. Okay, that we must take our humanity very seriously. So even if there weren't slavery, even if there weren't colonialism, many African thinkers, right, pre-colonial African thinkers, saw the question of our humanity as a fundamental question. It goes all the way back 4,000 years to Kununúp, who was, if you want to know who Kununúp is, just you could read a text called The Eloquent Peasant. It's from ancient Kemet, which later was renamed outside as Egypt. So that's one. I already said the second one. You have to talk about freedom. And freedom, you see, there's a distinction between liberty and freedom. Liberty is just the absence of constraints. But freedom carries with it the responsibility for living a life worth living, or taking responsibilities for a crappy life that you may have created. So, but to realize that human question and that freedom question are connected. The two are connected. So Africana philosophy basically, in order to ask the human question, this is the part that's different. It must address the dehumanization question. So that's why Africana philosophy talks about race, talks about sexism, talks about other forms of dehumanization, whether they're from anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, anti-LGBTQ, as long as those are a live issue, okay, the treatment of indigenous peoples, or any kind of, in other words, it's responding with clarity to the problem of dehumanization. Okay, so that's why I asked the question of what is humanization? Because as we know, you could answer that question in a dehumanizing way. Because one, if you say your humanity is to show you're like the people who dehumanize you, you would have lost, because you would have made dehumanization the standard. But if you take the position that you're the standard, without interrogating your behavior, your actions, without, creating metacritique, you could be a real problem. So philosophical anthropology, it turns out, in Africana philosophy, is a live, important philosophical problem. And it's linked to freedom, because freedom, it turns out to be a more rich concept than many of us realize. Freedom raises the problem of what I call Black melancholia. There are many forms of melancholia, but Black melancholia is the realization that prior to the emergence of the Euro-modern world, many people, nobody in the world is calling themselves Black people. There were a lot of people who were not even calling themselves white people. These are things created by that world. So now you have a weird situation. You're indigenous to a world, right? In the identity sense, that says you don't belong. See, if you're white and you say you're indigenous to the Euro-modern world, the Euro-modern world says you belong. But if you're Black and you're indigenous to the Euro-modern world, the Euro-modern world says it's better without you. That creates a profound kind of bereavement. Now, there's an answer for that, which I write a lot about, which is connected to the freedom question, which is you need to interrogate the problems of justification at heart in that situation I just posed. And what I argue is that it requires rethinking the very concept of what it is to be modern. You see, there are people who treat modern as European or as white, but no, all modern means is to belong to the present and have a connection to the future. Well, in antiquity, that meant there were and past moderns, because there was a certain point where to a lot of people Rome looked pretty cool, and there were a point where for a lot of people Thebes or in ancient Kemet or Egypt was pretty cool. And there was a time where we could name many ancient cities. I mean, come on, Sumer, I mean, they had ice cream. You know that? You know, in the ancient deserts of, yeah, they found a way to make ice cream. Well, it would be more like sorbet, but they made that, and that was cool. And we could keep going if if you go all the way back to very earliest hominins, yo, they can with certainty make fire. That's pretty cool, right? So that's one thing. But the justificatory practices, that's now a different philosophy. This is where you deal with the meta-theoretical stuff and how they connect to that philosophical, anthropological, and freedom stuff, right? They're connected. So, and then all the other things I brought up, dignity and these others. Now, here's the thing. These have metaphysical implications as well. If you have a metaphysics that's based on the idea of people being things, substances, then what's wrong if you thingify or objectify people and dehumanize them? So if you're going to argue for humanization, it may be, and actually I argue you should, be critical of substance metaphysics. So you may argue for relational metaphysics, and you could probably guess, I'll put my cards on the table. I'm a very pro dialectical, existential dialectical thinker, okay? And this shows the reason why. So, and then because you take the dehumanization issues very seriously, but you're not just reactive, you're constructing theory that can address these issues. And then you're willing to go radical enough to question philosophy itself. I wrote a book called Disciplinary Decadence, where I argued against varieties of disciplines, what happens when disciplines fall into decadence. The theory actually comes out of Nietzsche, not the theory of disciplinary decadence, but a conception of decadence. All right. But the antidote to it comes out of Kierkegaard, but Kierkegaard was thinking about ethics. The antidote to disciplinary decadence, which is when you treat your discipline as if it were created by God. And if you fetishize the methods, if you just follow the methods, you get all the answers. That means that the discipline is so inward, it's not paying attention to reality anymore. So it's decaying. However, to respond, you do what I call a teleological suspension of disciplinarity. It means you're willing to reach beyond the discipline for the sake of reality, which means you don't start thinking with as a philosopher or as a psychiatrist or as a this or that. That's for a specific set of problems. You draw upon in epistemic humility what you can learn from different approaches. It may be a philosophical answer, but you don't claim it as one in advance. So within that framework, uh, I see, I look for thinkers who do that. And I argue, especially if they're connecting it to issues of the African diaspora, I say they're an Africana philosopher. So like David Theo Goldberg, he, for me, I talk about him in the context of Africana philosophy. It doesn't mean that he's not other kinds. He's a Ashkenazi, Jewish. He's a Jewish South African who then, is retired now. But I think he's retired. I'm not sure, but was running the Institute for Humanities in UC Irvine. But there are many others. There's Sartre. Sartre engages so much. A lot of people have no idea of how much Black thought Sartre engaged. It doesn't mean he's not a French existentialist. It just means he's also an Africana philosopher. But and so Simone de Beauvoir, there are lots of things that's there. But there are others who, like V.Y. Mudimbe, he looks at African philosophy, he looks at V.Y. Mudimbe regards himself as an existentialist. He's obviously an African philosopher, an Africana philosopher. We could go through Kwame Ejice. He is a Ghanaian philosopher. He was an analytical philosopher, but if you look at his work, he always talked about what it meant to be human. How do you talk about freedom? How do you talk about justifications? I noticed this pattern in all of the people that I talk about. Then there's some people who are Black who don't talk about those things. I don't call them Africana philosophers. And I think it's problematic that some people just look at them as Black and call them Africana philosophers when they're not addressing these issues. They may just be looking at philosophy of mind or modal logic or something like that. That's not Africana philosophy. And so, but here's the other thing. I think creolization theory is part of Africana philosophy, and creolization theory is very relational. It basically says that we dehumanize when we look for purity because we have to erase our connectedness with others. So, so that's why Jane Anna Gordon, I would locate her in Africana philosophy. She wrote Creolizing Political Theory. Again, if you look at her arguments, those work in that regard. And then the list is, and in an introduction to Africana philosophy, I talk a lot about Africana philosophers and so forth. So within that framework, if we come to someone like Fanon, does he ask, what does it mean to be a human? Does he talk about freedom? Does he talk about justification? Does he talk about dignity? Does he talk about, and when he talks about dehumanization, does he talk about racism? Does he talk about the question of our relationship to Africa, Asia, or the global South? Click, check, 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 check. He's an Africana philosopher.
Well, I can't thank you enough again for really navigating us through all of these very um, complex and difficult ideas and really giving us a rich, um, a really rich understanding of the thought and life of Frantz Fanon. So I can't thank you enough for being here and participating in this series. So thank you so much, Dr. Gordon, for being here and participating. You've been absolutely wonderful.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and I really enjoyed speaking with you. Thank you. And to the audience, times are rough, but it's up to us to make a better future.